Thank you, Virginia. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Kat and this is Sarah, and we're really pleased to be able to present today about best practice food waste initiatives around the world. Now, Sarah and I are both really passionate about food waste. We actually met for the first time in the United States at a food waste summit. We were each individually travelling around the world to find out what is best practice food waste initiatives, what do they look like? So just so you know, these are the countries that between us we visited. So we were talking to experts to find out how the initiatives work and why. Now, food waste is a big challenge across Australia. I know you're all aware of this. It is one of the key waste streams remaining in landfills. But reducing food waste is also central to taking significant action on climate change, reducing our water consumption, feeding people facing food insecurity, saving households and businesses lots of money, and creating jobs in the circular economy. And I'm happy to say that there's a lot of action happening right now across Australia to tackle food waste. In 2017, the federal government launched the Food Waste Strategy for Australia to halve food waste by 2030. And more recently, a cooperative research centre has been set up based in South Australia to look at this issue. It's funded with $121 million over 10 years, which, as far as I'm aware, is the biggest of its kind in the world. So it's a really exciting time for Australia. And at the same time, we've got a lot of action happening in this very room at the more local level by councils, by businesses and not-for-profits. But as Australia puts a lot of energy into this area, we risk putting our time into the wrong spaces. We have an opportunity to learn from what other countries are doing, to find out what initiatives work and why, what pitfalls to avoid, key lessons, and how to set ourselves up for success. And that is the focus of our presentation today. This afternoon we'll be briefly touching on 4 areas that are important for driving improvements in food waste reduction and recovery. Due to time constraints, we're just going to touch on these really briefly. I'm going to talk about the first 2 topics, the role of price signals and food waste legislation, before handing over to Sarah to talk about targets and measurements and partnerships. Now, a big focus of my research was looking at how we can increase levels of food waste recycling by households. In my hometown of Adelaide, most residents are able to recycle their food waste via FOGO bins. But despite having this choice, we still see a huge proportion of food waste ending up in landfill. So I was looking at how we can change this. And the game changer that I came across was providing a price signal to recycle food waste. I visited 3 cities in northern Italy that are each diverting around 90% of food waste via their curbside municipal collections. The 3 cities I'm talking about are Milan, Parma and Somma Campagna. And now you'll notice from this table the population of these cities really varies. So on the one hand you have Milan, which is a high density city at 1.3 million people, through to Somma Campagna at just 15,000 residents and pretty low density. And as I mentioned before, each of these cities are diverting about 90% of their food waste via landfill. Now, their individual design of the curbside systems varies a little bit, but the one thing they had in common was a price signal or a financial incentive to help people to sort their food waste. So in the case of Parma and Somma Campagna, they have a pay-as-you-throw system. So as a resident living there, you have a fixed component of your waste bill and a variable component. Included in the fixed component are all of your recycling services and a minimum number of residual waste collections. In the variable component is just charged on the additional number of waste collections, residual waste collections that you choose to take. So if you do the right thing there and you sort your food waste and you sort your recyclables, you do not have to pay that variable component at all. And that has been a really effective driver for them to get that high level of food waste diversion. The other example is Milan. Milan, as I mentioned before, is a high density city. So pay-as-you-throw is a bit more tricky in that environment with people sharing bins. So they've taken a very different approach. They've actually introduced €50 fines for non-compliance, and they have inspection officers going and checking the bins. And interestingly, if they find food waste in the residual bin, they will slap that €50 fine on the whole building, which creates a really interesting social dynamic amongst neighbours, as you can imagine, making sure you're putting the right things in the bin there. So very different approach. So takeaways, there's many different ways to set up price signals depending on the size of your city. I've touched briefly on 3 case studies, but there's actually many more variations and ways to go about it. And I should say that it's not price signals in isolation. There's obviously a lot of other things happening behind the scene, including community engagement, education and other measures to support this. But what I've seen when I've been looking around the world and looking at the highest performing cities, it's really the price signal that is that game changer. So the next topic I want to touch upon is food waste legislation. And Virginia, I think you touched upon this one in your earlier presentation, so I think we're in agreement here. Food waste legislation is a game changer in driving outcomes for food waste diversion. And the two case studies I looked at was compostable bag legislation in Italy and landfill bans for C&I food waste in the United States. So to start with the compostable bag legislation, can I just have a raise of hands for who attended Shani's presentation yesterday on the supermarket bags? Brilliant. So this is very similar. So the cost of supplying compostable bags is a major barrier for councils across Australia. It's very expensive, you know, when you add it up to all the number of residents you have to supply them to. So we can look to Italy for some legislation that might help us to overcome this barrier. In 2011, Italy introduced legislation which required supermarkets to swap out plastic bags and plastic bags with compostable versions. And then in 2018, that legislation was expanded to include the produce bags for fruit and vegetables. So the way it works is you're a consumer shopping in a supermarket, you have to pay for these bags, they're already a couple of euro cents each, and you use them to buy your groceries. And then you can reuse them at home to recycle your food scraps. Now, Italy had a few pitfalls with this legislation, and I'm happy to touch on these in question time because I know we've got a short amount of time today, but these are easily overcome. Next to landfill bans for C&I food waste. So Massachusetts has many similarities to South Australia, which is where I'm from. They have a long history of landfill bans, but earlier they didn't have one on food waste. So they had composting facilities set up, they had commercial food waste collections, but still what they were finding is a lot of food waste was ending up in the landfill. So they decided to introduce a landfill ban for C&I organics, and this ban is applied to large food waste generators, so those that generate more than 1 tonne per week. And it really was a game changer. Within 4 years, the volumes of food waste diverted from landfill increased from 100,000 tonnes up to 260,000 tonnes. And what's really interesting about the case in Massachusetts is they didn't receive much resistance at all to this legislation, which really came down to its design. But again, I'll touch on this if anyone wants to ask more questions about that in question time to keep moving. So takeaways, legislation is a game changer, and also setting legislation gives confidence to the industry to invest in organics processing infrastructure. And I want to make this point here. I heard when I was sitting in the government panel session earlier today, one of the panellists said there's no point introducing legislation unless you have strong enforcement to back it up. I actually want to challenge that because I agree that strong enforcement will lead to better outcomes, but actually I have seen examples in San Francisco, in Malmö and Sweden where they've introduced bans on MSW food waste and they haven't heavily enforced it, and it has driven that behaviour change. It's about sending a signal to society that we do not waste food, we're not putting it into landfill. So opportunities for Australia: incentivise households to sort their food waste via a price signal, introduce legislation across each state mandating supply of compostable bags in supermarkets, and introduce landfill bans for food waste from both C&I and MSW sources. I think if Australia does this, we will be in a much better position to get food waste out of landfill. So I'd like to pass along to my colleague Sarah now.
All right, thanks Kat. So now we'll move to part 2, which is targets and measurement in partnerships. So firstly, I'd like to discuss the role of targets in setting an agenda for change and the critical importance of measuring against a food waste baseline. So it's worth noting that the key driver for national action on food waste in Australia, or one of them, is our national food waste target to halve food waste by 2030. So this target aligns with target 12.3 of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and it is that by 2030, countries should halve per capita food waste at the retail and consumer levels and reduce food losses along production and supply chains, including post-harvest losses. So one of the issues I was most focused on in my travels was whether this target was actually being absorbed or pulled into the national food waste policies of other countries. So the map on the screen here shows the picture as of late last year. And we should be proud that Australia is up there with the UK, the US, Japan and the EU in establishing food waste reduction targets that align with the Sustainable Development Goal target. And we're also one of very few countries to have a baseline, and as has been referenced in some earlier presentations, so that we actually know with at least some degree of confidence where the food is actually being wasted along the supply chain. So whether that's on the farm, manufacturing, wholesale, retail, hospitality, or even in our own homes. And for a bit of competition, our friends in New Zealand are yet to set a national food waste target or a baseline, although it's interesting to note that their Environment Select Committee is currently looking closely at opportunities for New Zealand to do more nationally on food waste. So targets can really help in setting a direction on food waste, but a 2030 target, which is 10, 11 years away, is still quite a long time frame. And it's my view that we really need interim targets or milestones to check if we're tracking towards the 2030 goal. So, for example, Norway has this. They want to cut food waste by 15% by 2020. By 2025, they want to cut food waste by 30%. And that means that by the time 2030 rolls around, they will both be well advanced in the kinds of systemic changes that are actually needed to drive food waste reduction, but they'll also know if they're on track to reach that 2030 halving food waste target. And it would be really great to see Australia take a similar approach in the food waste implementation plan that's currently under development. And a final point I'd like to make on targets is that they really don't have to be just national. So, for example, Washington DC recently committed to reducing food waste by 60% by 2032, and London, as another example, has committed to cutting food waste by 1/3 by 2025, and again to halve it by 2030. But I would make the point that these targets are great, but they can't stand alone, and they do need to be supported by good baseline data and also a roadmap with actions for achieving it. So, building on the theme of targets and roadmaps, one thing that's become extremely clear to me is that there's only so much that different parts of the food value chain can do in isolation on food waste. And so the final theme of our presentation is the power of partnerships, and in particular, voluntary agreements or commitments, and also how essentially how they are a critical tool for making material food waste reductions. So when the Australian government announced the National Food Waste Strategy and Target in late 2017, it also committed to a voluntary commitment program that will, and I quote, initially engage businesses and industries to commit to actions that reduce food waste. And as Virginia mentioned in a presentation earlier this afternoon, there are significant opportunities in commercial food waste. Yet to date in Australia, I would suggest that most of the focus has been on that household food waste. So this voluntary agreement or voluntary commitment that's been committed to, which is yet to be rolled out, will be a really important vehicle for driving measurable progress in the C&I sector on reducing food waste. So luckily for us, there's been a few trailblazers when it comes to developing these kinds of voluntary agreements. And one I'll focus on right now is the UK. So in the UK, the Courtauld 2025 agreement involves more than 150 organisations, which includes businesses, trade and sector organisations, and also local authorities. And members actually pay to be involved because they see that there's a really clear business case for it. Reducing food waste saves them money. So together they have several clear targets, including to reduce food and drink waste by 20% from 2015 to 2025. I'd also encourage you to look at the UK's food waste reduction roadmap, which drills down further into how businesses can individually contribute to cutting food waste. So it's also worth noting that the Courtauld 2025 agreement is actually the fourth iteration of the Courtauld agreement. The UK has been doing this for a very long time in comparison to countries like Australia. So what do robust voluntary agreements look like? Well, for one, they have very clear membership, and members are high-level representatives of their organisations, and I would suggest that this is absolutely crucial to success. They enable cooperation in a pre-competitive environment, and they place obligations on their members. So, for example, in the UK, you can't actually join the Courtauld 2025 agreement unless you agree to share your food waste data, which has to be harmonised to an agreed standard. And at a sector level, of course, this aggregated data can help identify food waste hotspots and enables targeted research and potentially other responses. So, as I mentioned, Australia's voluntary agreement or commitment hasn't been developed yet, but I want to highlight the opportunities we have not only for getting this right, but also the consequences and risks if we get it wrong. So, effective voluntary agreements need resourcing to drive momentum and to support members with the tools that they need to participate. And they need to provide a value proposition for these members. So, as is the case in the UK, I would expect that food waste data sharing would form a central part of the Australian voluntary agreement as a sort of price of entry. Without these kinds of tools and benefits and obligations, there's a real risk of Australia's voluntary agreement becoming a fairly toothless working group, which I would suggest would be a really unfortunate result. Quite simply, here in Australia, we're not going to hit our national target of halving food waste by 2030 without building deep trust and cooperation between all the major players in the food supply chain or the food value chain. And again, this needs to be sufficiently resourced or it will fail. So to conclude this section, some opportunities for Australia. One is to progress Australia's implementation plan for reducing food waste, and I would note this is currently under development, so it'll be great to see that soon. Two is to consider implementing interim targets or milestones to drive shorter-term action and accountability as well. And three, we have to be so careful not to half-bake our voluntary agreement. It's absolutely central to success, I believe, and other parts of the world like the UK, Nordic states and the EU stand ready to help us learn from their experiences, recognising, of course, that Australia will have its own challenges and limitations. All right, so just to wrap this up, if we're serious about addressing food waste in Australia, we really need to take heed of the following. One is that the food waste space lacks legislation, and this is a real game changer. We need it to divert more food from landfill. Two, as Kat mentioned, nothing drives behaviour change like a well-targeted price signal. Three, targets focus action, and they need to be measured and supported by a roadmap. Targets by themselves, are quite easy to, they can fall by the wayside. And four, we should be striving for progress and not perfection when it comes to food waste data. This means not letting the perfect become the enemy of the good. And so it's really great to see that we've got, despite challenges, a food waste baseline in Australia. And I'd note that it's always possible to recalculate or tweak the baseline, and we've seen this happen in the UK recently. And lastly, we're not going to be able to make the kinds of systemic changes we need with everyone only working in their own segment of the food supply chain. We really need deep trust and cooperation, and I would suggest this requires buy-in from the absolute top. So that is, our politicians and CEOs of organisations. This can't be kind of pushed down the chain. All right, and that's my cue. So I just end with that we have a huge opportunity to start building this cooperation through the forthcoming voluntary agreement. And so this concludes our presentation, but of course happy to answer questions. And we've also got, as you can see, some more information, reports, case studies on the links above. But thank you for having us.